this makes me very curious. Like, what was the calling that you had to start sharing your message on all of this?
I noticed that there wasn't much of a representation for South Asian people in the podcast community. And I wanted to be one of those to talk about generational traumas, stigmas, taboos, things of that sort. Just someone that people can relate to. So that's why I started.
Everyone is going through similar, sometimes emotional struggles and different issues with family, but it is very specific culturally too. And if you don't hear that voice and you don't know, you can feel very isolated. So what you're doing is important for that. And I really hope people listening will also maybe be from your community or know people who are, and they can share the episode, because it really makes a difference when you can see and hear from someone who is like you in that way.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And to add on to that, I feel like it's not only like South Asians, but I feel like other communities as well can probably relate to what I'm saying. It doesn't specifically have to be like about my community, but for the most part, I feel like other people can also relate to generational traumas, setting boundaries, things of that sort.
True. We'll dive into that because it's very true. We've all been struggling with it, and I think it's only now in the last 5 to 10 years, probably 5 years really, that it's more common to speak about it and to for people to share their own stories. I imagine for you too, like it's not easy, is it? Starting to share some of these things that you're going through and being so visible.
Oh no. Oh no, especially like just with the type of culture I grew up in and you having to speak your mind and things of that sort, it can be hard, but you have to train yourself not to do that. Yeah.
What has been the thing that you shared or talked about that you felt like was the most challenging at first, but you feel really good that it got out there?
Speaking your mind and being your authentic self. And I know it sounds cliche, but where I come from and the culture that I come from, it's not easy to do that. You feel like you have the society's eyes on you at all times. You have people's expectations of you. You have your parents' expectations of you. And that has an impact on your identity and what your needs and requirements are. So I think this is something that I've worked on over the last few years where I'm like, no, like I have my negotiables and non-negotiables, and I'm going to live the life that I want to live. And I'm slowly working on that. And that also comes with setting boundaries, right? You have to kind of create a space and bubble for yourself to make sure you have the right support system and just to kind of tune out and mute anyone or anything that is not on your path, right? So your journey to figuring yourself out and living an authentic life.
How has it been for you doing that? Because it's as you said that it can be harder in some, situations and communities to put down those boundaries than others. So what has it been like for you doing that? And what kind of advice would you give for anyone that's also struggling a bit with that, where they feel like they can't live or their authentic life or the way that they want to express feels that that's not possible for them because of the judgment or the pressure that they're facing?
Yeah, so definitely easier said than done. It requires time, it requires consistency, and you just have to keep reminding yourself why you're doing this. And communication is also very important, especially when you're setting boundaries. For example, like with family members, right? Because they're so close to you, if you have a good relationship with them, you have to understand that, yeah, there's like guilt associated to it. So you have to communicate why you're doing things a certain way. You have to encourage yourself and you have to be around women and people that also empower you. So I think a good support group is also very important. And if you don't have that, you kind of have to build that for yourself. And it takes time. It's definitely not easy. I still have my days where I'm like, "Oh, I shouldn't have done this or I shouldn't have said this or I shouldn't have been a part of this," but it's much better than how I would have handled it before.
It's not an exact science from what you're saying, it's true, like, you can't putting the boundaries down sometimes you can say something the wrong way, or you can hurt someone you didn't mean to, or all these, like, repercussions, right? But then at the fundamental core, like you've said, it's better for me to live this way and be truer to myself than for me to not do that. It will never come out exactly the way you want, and everyone responds perfectly. it would be a lot easier to have boundaries if it did.
Yeah, exactly. And then I feel like you're robbing yourself of that joy and happiness that you deserve in your life. You just have to remind yourself that, hey, like I have this one life. I can make it however I want to make it. And that requires me to do certain things. It's like a responsibility that you owe to yourself.
The communication piece, though, that you talked about as part of the journey, I think is really key here too, because it's all in how you communicate what that boundary is, or you explain why it's this way. Because I'm going to ask you about this in your direct experience, but I've personally felt like a lot of the boundaries would have been more respected if I could have communicated it better for them. Like, if they could have really understood why I needed that, then maybe it would have went down a little bit better. I don't know how your experience has been. I know it's been a couple years journey through it.
I've had my moments where I definitely have not communicated things properly, or I'll get a little like, you get triggered sometimes. You get triggered, you can get reactive, like you're human, depending on like who you're talking to. And you just have to remind yourself that, there are ways to talk to people. And I'm learning that as well. And another thing, even if you communicate properly and you feel like you're doing your best, you can agree to disagree and no one can enforce anything on you. And if they are, then you just distance yourself, right? Like someone could have a different like viewpoint, religious, political, whatever it may be. And that's okay. They're entitled to that, but you're entitled to your own viewpoints as well. You just got to figure out what works out for you at the end. So yes, communication is key. And if communication isn't working and if there's no understanding, then you just have to accept it and maybe distance yourself. I think that would help a lot.
Let me ask you a little bit about kind of backing up because this is something that's probably really fundamental to what you're doing now. How does your identity feel being Pakistani and being American? What is it like having those 2 very different influences?
Yeah, it could be a constant tug of war sometimes. So, I mean, for the most part, like I came to America when I was like 2 years old. So I grew up here basically. So I'm more exposed to the American culture. But then of course, like the family that I come from, they are, they're more geared towards the Pakistani culture. So there are certain things if I don't agree with or I don't want to be involved with, it could be a tug of war. It could get complicated. But then there's also aspects of the Pakistani culture I really do like the food and sometimes like the events, things of that sort. I do enjoy those things. But then again, it's just the expectations, especially for women when it comes to marriage and having kids, divorce, how to take care of your parents, like career wise. I don't necessarily agree with those things. But it also kind of helps because I grew up here as well.
Growing up, was it more challenging with some of these areas, or did you feel like it was more towards now, like this decade that you're in, where some of this stuff popped up a little bit more because you are growing into being a woman, you're going into the next stages of life? Was there anything before that as well, or is it definitely more now that you feel it?
Especially as a child, like, I would notice things and I would disagree with it a lot, and I remember just telling my mom, "Why do we do things this way?" And she wouldn't have an answer for me. I always kind of felt like the odd one out, like, in a group setting or something because I'm like, "I just don't agree to a lot of these things," and I just had, like, a different viewpoint. So I think definitely struggled more growing up, especially with having low self-esteem issues, and of course, not being able to set boundaries and things of that sort because I'm so young and people pleasing tendencies. So now I feel like it was still hard for me to set these expectations and boundaries, but at least I feel like in terms of identity, I now know who I am.
I think it definitely gets easier with, like, every 5 to 10 years, no matter what your background is. I guess if we can dive a bit deeper into your specific experience, what are some of the cultural norms or values or just way of being that have been not necessarily a struggle for you, but, you're trying to find your way to operate within them and still respect yourself and the life that you're designing? What are some of the things that have come up? Because I'm sure people listening will be able to relate.
So one example I can think of is so I married someone outside of my culture, right? So I married an American and a Pakistani American, and I know a lot of times it could be a stigma, and it's kind of frowned upon that you're marrying someone that's not part of your culture or your religion, and what's going to happen to the kids. It's kind of like you're betraying the community. But for me, I feel like my concern was more of my parents than the society, if anything. But I've had a lot of long conversations with my parents about my husband, Jesse, and I think that was something that we did struggle with initially, but eventually I think it came to a point that my parents really did like him. And it also has to come down to how I know I'm using this word a lot, boundaries, but it's just the expectations that I'm setting for my family that, hey, like this is my life. He makes me happy. This is the lifestyle that I want to live. And it does not necessarily reflect, with your onto your perspectives or viewpoints, but this is my life and this is the type of life that I want to live. And it could be, religious viewpoints, lifestyles, things of that sort. So I had set certain expectations with my family, and it took some time. But that is definitely something that I struggled with. And I've been married for what, 2.5 years now.
And that's a big, decision as well, I know, like, to do that, and knowing that it's a continual journey, do you feel like first question is, were you the first in your family to marry outside of your culture?
Yes, I was.
How is the people who are younger in your family, how have they reacted to it?
They are really happy that I went through with this. I'm kind of like setting a path for them because if they wanted to do it, at least there's somebody in the family that has already done it. So that helps. Yeah.
I think it's amazing that you did it, and it's no small feat. My husband is Indian, Gujarati, but he wasn't the first one to marry outside of the culture. So he had what would have been his cousin that was like you, and she was the one, and I really think that that helped make it a lot easier for the integration. Obviously, there's always still stuff, but I really feel for anyone listening, like if you are already in a relationship or you really love someone who is of a different culture, you can be such an inspiration to other people without you even realizing it.
I haven't talked about this a lot, but like I was married once before when I was much younger to somebody that was like from the same culture. And, at that age, I was much younger. I realized that just because someone is from the same religion or culture, like you may just not be happy, you just may not be compatible. It's just it really does come down to lifestyle. I think lifestyle compatibility is really important. So my main focus is this person going to make me happy? Do we have similar values and lifestyles? And that's what worked out for me and Jesse. So it's like I already knew what I didn't want at that point. And then like when I see someone who gives me something that I'm like, okay, this is definitely going to work out for me, that was it, and that was another thing that I leveraged to my parents when I introduced, Jesse to them. So and then they saw that I was truly happy and, I was trying to live the life that I want, and I think they respected that for sure.
Because you mentioned earlier you've got certain expectations and boundaries that you have in place, especially around this relationship. What are some of those ones that you've used that have really helped you so that everyone's integrating in the family and you and Jesse are operating, your happiest with them?
So the culture that I come from, like the Pakistani culture, it's very similar to Indian culture. There's a lot of family involvement. I think that's a culture that we come from. It is like that. And so I had to make it very clear that, hey, we're not going to attend like all these events. We're not going to be part of everything. That can be a little too much for not only Jesse, but for me too. It can be overwhelming. We don't necessarily have to be involved in every little thing because for him it's also complicated. This is all very new to him as well. Um and then that also comes down to religion as well, I think expecting something from my husband or the way that we live our life or the way we want to raise our kids, that's on us. And that's the way we're going to live our lives, and no one has a say in anything. And I think Sometimes my parents would like give advice. I get it because they're more religious, but at the end it's our life and it's the way that we want to approach our life and raise our children in the future. So that was another like expectation that I laid out from the beginning like, hey, you can't say this to Jesse about religion or things that he has to do. This is between us. This is a conversation that should be happening between only me and Jesse. It's like our little bubble. You know what I mean? Because of that family involvement and things of that sort.
It's a good thing that you had that conversation with them because there's definitely a different way of interacting that I see that I can see where it would be normal for them to talk to him about this stuff because they're used to it, but for him, it would seem kind of different, and he might feel the sort of pressure around it because he wants to be respectful, so I completely get that, and I can see how having that in place is really important. Even if he were from the same culture, to be honest, I think some of these conversations are between you guys and not actually the extended family.
Yeah, yeah. Like I have to be the one to make sure that I like represent my husband and to let him know, hey, like I'll buffer out the situation. Like I'm here for you. You're my priority. So like I kind of have to be that middleman to kind of make sure it all works out.
You mentioned a little bit about the self-esteem behind boundaries, but I also feel a huge part of it can be the people-pleasing aspect when you're kind of raised to make sure that everyone is kind of harmonious and things are working. Did you feel any aspect of that? Was that anything you had to overcome, or did you feel that that was not so much an issue as some of the other?
I was a hardcore people pleaser, at the expense of making sure that I wasn't feeling guilty or someone's not judging me or someone's like thinking of me a certain way. And I had to slowly let those like characteristics of me go, like the people pleasing characteristic. And I had to understand, wait, why am I doing this in the first place? Right? Like, why am I being a people pleaser? So, like in my 20s, you just want to be accepted. And, I think it also comes down to like your childhood traumas and things of that sort. You really have to figure out why you're doing something or why something triggers you. And then as I got older, I realized people are going to talk regardless. People are going to say things about you regardless and judge you regardless. And if someone is meant to be in your life and truly loves you, setting those boundaries and having the right support system is all you need. And then that kind of just, the people that are not meant to be in your life, they just go away.
And that's a big switch too, because if you are always thinking about what's this person's reaction going to be to this, or how can I make sure, also trying to take control of it, that they have XYZ reaction. And then you realize, like you said, you can't control any of it. You could do everything the way you're supposed to, and it could be taken differently. So in the end, it just has to be like, what can you have some measure of agency in? And that's you, right? That's your actions, that's your pursuits in life.
Again, yeah, it's just like you are worried about there's people other people's reactions, but at the same time, people who love you and respect you will respect what you're laying out for them.
You were saying earlier, which was a really good point, about how the boundaries do not mean that you both agree on the same viewpoint. You can have totally different decisions about religion, politics, whatever, but you can have that boundary in place. And I think when you have the boundary there, it makes those kind of interactions easier because you don't have to dive into the religion. You don't have to dive into the politics.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Like I have people in my life that I don't necessarily agree with their viewpoints or lifestyle, but I've had a great time with them.
What were some of the expectations around career then that you mentioned? Because we've talked a bit about the boundaries with relationships and communication there, but you also mentioned briefly that there was differences around career.
Yeah. When I mentioned that, I think my parents were really good about, well, more so my mom. She was really good about, oh, you should definitely build a career for yourself and things of that sort. But I think from a societal expectation and even coming from my dad, it's like, well, a girl should be more focused on getting married first than giving her importance to her career. So that's what I mean by that it's as like from coming from a Pakistani like culture, there's more importance for a girl to get married and have children.
Is there other things that you feel like, because I'm asking this because some people listening already have children and they are in your community. Are there certain expectations, boundaries that you would wanna make sure you have for your kids related to the wider family on your side?
For me growing up, like, my grandmother would tell me something, my aunt would tell me something, and then there would be, like, issues because of that, but I want to make sure that my kids feel like, "Hey, we are your support system. It's me and your dad." And they're also there for you, but we're the ones we are your providers, and, do you see what I'm trying to say? As opposed to, like, focusing on other people in the family.
That's a big one because I'm sure, like, anyone listening knows there's lots of inputs coming from lots of people, and it isn't always, sometimes it's contradictory, and it is like, who is the main person that I follow? Who is the one that I go to first about this? Like, who's, especially when you're younger, how do I figure that out? And I can see that that's an important thing too. Yeah, definitely. The unsolicited advice, though, that's across cultures, that's everyone.
Oh, I know.
It's so funny too when you said earlier about a big thing for you is you're not gonna go to all the events because that was a big one that we had to establish as well.
Yeah, like, "You have to show your face everywhere," and I'm like, "No, I don't," you know? It can be overwhelming, it can be really overwhelming.
It's definitely the idea of, like, showing your face to show that you're there, that you care, but if you're not, it doesn't mean that you don't. It just means that there's a lot of things and there's a lot of people in the family.
Yeah, exactly.
Where do you see your show going in the future? Like, what are some of the topics that you wanna touch on, specifically related to your background, but also maybe other personal growth areas that you're exploring?
I started off doing this because, again, I wanted that representation for the South Asian community. But not only that, like, my podcast is about lifestyle and personal growth. And I do want to continue to do that and also focus more on women empowerment.
And these are really great topics for you to cover, but even just the conversations, you can have so much impact by having those different people on and to share with maybe topics people don't always, talk about very openly. What do you feel is like what has been the best part about you having your show?
My podcast episodes have impacted people. Like, I've had friends come up to me and they're like, "Sonia, I'm so glad that you spoke about these points." I've had random people reach out to me and said, "Hey, I can relate to this. You're doing great." That makes me feel good because I know that I've empowered somebody or impacted someone's life, and that's a great feeling. That was like the main reason why I did this, so people can know, "Hey, you're not in this alone. There's also someone else that's also going through this with you, and we're in this together." So I would say that's the main thing that I've loved about creating my podcast series, and also learning more about myself as well. Like, when you're talking and you're recording and you're saying things and you're scripting, you kind of learn more about yourself in that sense because you're putting yourself out there. And then you kind of realize, hey, these are, my good qualities or things that I need to work on. So it is a form of therapy in a way for myself too, I feel like. So I think that's another thing that came out of creating my own podcast series.
Certain things come up, you share, and it's such a more intimate space than, so for example, like on videos you can share, of course, but I think there's something about the audio aspect that just feels a lot safer, I
Yeah.
guess, more open.
Yeah. It's like you're on the phone. You can be vulnerable. And I think I've definitely done that. I've definitely been vulnerable. It is like therapy. Yeah.
Well, I'm excited to see how it evolves and the conversations that you continue to have come out. So I want to ask you, for people listening, if they want to find you and they want to listen, where can they connect?
I'm on all major streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. So it's just Sonia Space Podcast, Instagram as well, Sonia Space Podcast.
Thank you for sharing your journey and for really opening up about this. I know that it's not some of the easiest topics, but I think you sharing can really make some people feel heard and seen.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for having me.